Welcome everyone. I'm here with Lawrence Rouse, who's terrific. He's been on our webinars, and thanks for coming on, Lawrence. Let me
Hi,
start.
David.
Hey, awesome, great to have you. Um, and let's start by asking you just a little bit of background with yourself and law of implication, kind of when you got started with it, and anything that's kind of particularly poignant to you, and then we can get into the main topic. Wonderful, John. Thank you. Hey, Mike. What is that gift? What is that, Mike? Who's that guy in the back? Who's the white guy? Anyway, all right. 57 with who? Anyway, I don't want to get too sidetracked. But anyway, okay, Lawrence. Yeah, but who is it? Is that like Patrick Stewart or just something else?
It
Um,
looks like him. That's my guess.
yeah. All right. All right. So continuing on. Okay, Lawrence, why don't you take it away for a little bit? Just kind of address the little bit of background, like I said.
Yeah, so I've been here since 2016, Project Assimilation, and the first glimpse that I got at LOI was your videos about you were explaining how to learn SEO and how it was going to be a process of building a framework and then building details in. And it helped me have the patience that was probably going to be required to do it in such a way that I
Mhm.
didn't get as frustrated as I could have been.
Mhm.
And that's kind of where I noticed just how practically useful this was going to be. But
Mhm.
the point where I noticed that this was different than anything else out there was when I started to come on your alchemy webinars. I believe that was no, actually, you had some recordings back in the day about 2013 LOI, and I went into those and eventually just going through those and building and trying to understand exactly what you were saying, I got to a point where I realized that this wasn't like anything else. Like there was a certain truth to what you were saying that was missing in pretty much any other form of philosophy or self-help that I was
Mhm.
trying to find throughout the years, but it just wasn't as clear as you were communicating. And even though it took some time to really realize just how important this was,
Mhm. Not
I
that I'm
I
always clear, but yeah.
I feel like you're definitely more clear than I would be if I was trying to explain it, because I definitely try to explain
Thank
it
you.
to
Yes,
friends,
I
and
like
it's very confusing. Like even though I understand certain things, it's hard
to
to
explain the
communicate
topic
it.
itself, not myself. Anyway,
Yeah,
continue. Don't mean to interrupt.
I like that. I like that, so I can give myself a break as well.
Mhm. Yeah.
But there's a certain difficulty in trying to explain
Mhm.
this to people that don't have that framework that you talk about. So I appreciate what you're
Mhm.
trying to do, and I get how difficult it can be. But
Yeah,
that's
people are so quick to call themselves like smart or the opposite, like in a certain topic, like, oh, I'm not smart enough to understand search engine optimization, or or I'm smart at this, I'm not smart at that. And yeah, it's not for anyone that hasn't heard my previous stuff, it's on that. It's not, it's silly to be dismissive or marginalize yourself or others like that. Whether you're good at something or not is a matter of having a framework or letting that framework build. And you might not be smart, quote unquote, today, but literally you can watch something, it might not make much sense, and then sleep on it. And the very next day, you are a lot, quote unquote, smarter than you were the day before. And certainly, that can layer and build, and looking at getting rid of that blanket concept of smart and instead seeing it as a framework that you do or don't have is a lot more empowering, and it makes people more patient with themselves as well, and so forth.
right, and even something is like that can come across as simple, like when you hear it, but
Mhm.
it's so profound in the way that it's both empowering and incredibly simple. Like it's a
Yeah, and it's very counterintuitive in practice. Like as you say it might sound kind of simple or obvious when I say it, but in terms of how people actually think and act, and in essence sabotage themselves relative to what they could do, or write themselves off too early, or are too arrogant, early on, or feel like it's a measure of their greatness or smarts to how fast they learn something, when instead it's really just, again, it's some frameworks you already have like part of it for yourself, then you feel smart, other times you don't. And you don't need to feel stupid. You just say, oh, I don't have the framework or the ability, like it doesn't build as fast in certain areas, for people. Like for me, learning languages just doesn't happen very quickly or easily. But it's still a matter of framework. Anyway, continue.
Yeah, that's pretty much where I was for a very long time. But again, even though I understood how different this was than everything else, and I knew that I wanted to dedicate essentially the rest of my life to this because I saw that it was, if not the answer, it was at least the closest thing to the truth that I had come up to until that point in time. But I was still
Yeah.
kind of how Megan described it last time she was on. I was borrowing your understanding for a very large part of it. I was trying to only go as deep as I needed to in order to get the results that I wanted, which at the time, and still to this point, is more of a stable base in the financial win that you talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So I was getting nuggets here and there, and I was really just kind of I wasn't going as deep as I needed to. And recently, maybe like in the last 12 months or so, I decided to just try to build everything up from the ground up myself. And
Oh,
that's where
nice.
I'm at right now, which is why I don't know if I'm being too strict. I don't know if I'm um, going about it the right way necessarily, but that's part of the reason why I was giving you any pushback on that post about China that you posted on MeWe, because I didn't see how we could know any of that. So
Yeah.
I'm trying to.
And really, you weren't wrong at all. I mean, it's really more speculation. I agree. And I was kind of a little emotional at that time as well. So it may well be on a very good track. I don't regret posting it about, how deep China, can kind of go with the leadership of the U.S. and so forth, is what Lawrence is referring to, and a pretty cool article. Like, but yeah, I don't think you're off base in that at all. Like you're basically right in that it. Anyway, yep.
Which is great, by the way. Like I don't doubt necessarily that any of that is happening.
Hmm.
I believe it's very reasonable and within the realm of possibility that all of that is indeed happening. I just didn't see how we could know any of that, and that's kind of where I'm at right
Right,
now. That
right.
I'm trying
No, and
to.
we really ultimately agree on that. I'm kind of pretty much exactly where you are on that. Believe, strangely enough.
And yeah, so I mean, essentially that's where I'm at right now. I'm trying to
Mhm.
build on what I know, and I don't know, I don't have much built, but what I do have built, like I can at least feel very confident in that. Probably for the not probably pretty much for the first time in my life, which is huge,
Mhm.
including some of the aspects to God's existence, which is also groundbreaking, pretty much on every
Excellent.
level.
And I'll stress something that I've stressed somewhat recently as well, I think, but um, it's such a good thing to. It's kind of like the flip side of a block that people run into. It's such a good thing to value knowing something properly, without feeling
Yes.
like, oh, it's not enough, right? Because that's how you get more of it, rather than be like, oh, well, I don't know how to know what I feel like I need to know instantly, and therefore it's all worthless to know things. I'm just gonna bypass all that and decide that I know, and wave my hand at it, which is of course the kind of the fundamental problem that people run into, is this feeling like our mind decides it needs to give us that, of this false certainty, and how important it is to protect us from having any sense that it's false certainty, and feeling like the false certainty is real certainty, and it's very inefficient, feeling incorrectly, but feeling, the mind gives us an incorrect feeling, but a very powerful feeling that feels true, even though it's incorrect, which is, that, um, the certainty that we feel is real, and that especially that it's very inefficient and unimportant to find a way to get real understanding, and therefore certainty in a different way.
Yeah, it definitely it definitely took me several attempts from your part, like for me to really understand that part, which was
Hmm.
to respect what I did know. And there was a
Hmm.
way where I was, I guess, marginalizing it, but like
Yeah.
even the very basic things, like the fact that I am obviously conscious, and
Hmm.
the fact that I'm conscious means that something is aware that I am conscious, which is who I am, Like
Hmm.
as basic as that is, like that's the fact that I know that for certain, there's no way that that can be wrong
Hmm.
is is powerful in a different way than just
It's an
kind of
unbelievably big paradigm shift and critically important to not just realize that, as you say, but value it.
yeah, yeah.
Like devaluing that is like the opposite paradigm, and it's a big block, right? It's not until someone can value those first initial baby steps, so to speak, of real knowledge that they can move forward in a
Okay.
powerful way.
So at least I'm in the right, direction. That's
Yeah,
good.
excellent. Yeah, it's so valuable for me for you to come on and to do this series in general, or hearing where people are at and what impacted them and their journey. Even in a nutshell, it's still great.
And it's part of the reason why I wanted to get on because I can appreciate how, from your perspective, it's probably hard to really pinpoint like where we're at because,
Mhm.
like you mentioned, it's probably difficult for you to differentiate between what's like something that you're particularly good at versus how good you are at using the method itself. And
Mhm.
sometimes I definitely question that myself. Like, is this something that like why am I not getting this perhaps as quickly as David might have? But that's an irrelevant question, really, because it doesn't matter.
Mhm.
But I just coming on here to try to help fill the gap as best as I can, I guess.
Yeah, and other people hearing from you, and others that are not me. Like there's your experience, your way of saying something. All that can just be, of course, very valuable, as I'm sure it was valuable hearing Megan.
Agreed.
Joseph writes here in the chat, I identify greatly with what you're saying, Lawrence. Joseph
Yeah.
Montero.
Okay. Yeah. No. Um. I don't doubt that there's a lot of us who are trying to understand this, and there's
Mhm.
certain blocks that we're running into that are probably universal.
Mhm.
So yeah, no, I'm happy to do this, and I'd love to hear other people's points of view as well.
Excellent. Oh, great to have you on, Dave Keys. Okay, so is there anything else that you want to share that impacted you before we get to the main topic, or are you good? Either way is great with me.
Um, Honestly, yeah, just like I said, being able to differentiate between things that I know for certain and what I don't know has been easily the most impactful thing so far. Um,
Hmm.
and the ultimate decision to just kind of like giving giving myself up to having to build it up from the foundation and not just trying to borrow your understanding and shortcut my way to the results that I'm trying to get to.
Yeah, when I do my next series, that'll be kind of ideally a definitive series for people, kind of comprehensive and definitive. I'm really honing in on something that's similar to how I began alchemy with that defense against the defense, but I think there's just this such a powerful core of our psyche where our mind has determined that, like early on, that it needs to give us this, like it's as if our mind concluded that there's no way to get like real certainty, because without being conscious it can't get it anyway. You can't get actual knowledge, and your mind's not even conscious, and then it's there and it's trying to help us survive and so forth, and we need some sense of confidence in something, and some sense of the world in order to move forward and survive and such. And so our mind, it's a little bit metaphorical what I'm saying. Again, you're kind of I'm a little bit anthropomorphizing our mind, but it's like it needs to give us a sense of certainty, and then it can't give us a sense of certainty. It's a little bit like if you find yourself in a position where you're leading people and you don't feel totally confident yourself, right? But you feel like you need to project confidence or else they won't follow, and the task won't get done, right? So first thing you feel as a leader is you need to project confidence, right? But if you don't know for sure that everything's going to work out, then you need to kind of hide, in essence, sort of from yourself and from others, the fact that you're sort of a little bit or a lot faking the confidence, right? Or making up the difference, so to speak, of how confident you deserve to be or feel versus the actual knowledge that you have. So our mind is like in that position with us. And so it almost builds, and then there's a parallel to this in culture at large, where it builds this whole kind of defense or your whole knowledge of the world, your whole sense of the world is kind of based on starting with not realizing that your mind, kind of like that leader, like your mind is projecting this perfect sort of confidence about some things. Not that you always feel confident about everything, no one does, right? But there's this kind of general sense of confidence about your basic way to like know about the world and navigate the world or whatever, where you feel like you know all sorts of stuff and that you know, therefore know how to know stuff. So again, your mind has this, it's like as if people's biggest fear, it's like our mind is keeping us from acknowledging its biggest fear, which is that it doesn't know what it knows. So it's not like people are aware that they're afraid that they don't have an epistemology, a way of really knowing what's true. It's like they're afraid to even look there, right? Like our mind keeps it from us that it doesn't have an epistemology. It doesn't have a way to know things that is actually accurate. Like its way of knowing things is flawed, and if you carry that through logically, flawed is like really a problem when it comes to like how do you know things? Because if like just part of the time it's just wildly off, but you feel certain. And then so our mind keeps us from looking there, and it feels so inefficient and unimportant, or we just feel like I don't know what it's like for you. I kind of get this irrational feeling when my mom starts kind of talking about certain topics, for me, where I just feel really bored really fast. And I'm not saying that's good. I'm not saying that she's inherently boring, but I feel that feeling. And it's like that, with what our mind does. It's like it's trying to protect us from even looking there by making it feel unimportant, making us feel bored. It might give us all these other things that we need to do in that, as we start looking there, distract us like people do with infants, like redirect them. Whatever it does, it's like this strong protection against looking there with a real seriousness and feeling like it matters and it's exciting and it's interesting. It can feel, again, counterproductive and everything where it should, as a defense. And it's that we're up against as we try to work at it ourselves and then share with others, right? Like it kind of feels like either the most unimportant thing or like nonsense or like, what are you talking about? If you're talking to someone, even someone you know well, and you say like, no, I actually know how to know things. And they'll be like, oh yeah, sure, me too. Or what the heck are you talking about? Like it's kind of a nonsense phrase to them. Their mind instantly reinterprets it from what you're trying to say. And it's like they'll keep reinterpreting it as this defense. It's like this crazy sort of weird, like from our perspective, it's like they're insane in a sense that they can't hear what you're saying. Like their mind just keeps on hearing something different. It's like in there's a cartoon my son watched a few years ago, Blaze and the Monster Machines, and there'd be a funny thing where anyway, someone would ask for something and then they would give them something that rhymed with it, and they would keep like not hearing what the person was asking for. I wish I could give a better example. It's kind of funny actually when I did it, but yeah, so that's what we're all running into, and that's what the puzzle is for me and for everyone else that wants to share this with people is how do we get through that defense, both with ourselves and then with others, but then watching ourselves do it and hearing our journeys with each other or sharing it can both help encourage us and help give each other clues for how to help break through it in others, right? So it's in essence, kind of the central puzzle. I think a lot of us have a lot figured out at this point, even if we feel like we don't, or we feel like we do, whatever. But a lot of us are pretty far along, but that central question, again, both with ourselves and with others, I think really remains to a certain degree, right? We've all broken through it to a decent degree or a significant degree, personally, but we're still trying to break through more. And then how do we help how do we kind of do like a sales funnel for other people?
Yeah, I mean, to this day, I still, even though it's been 5 years since I first came across you, like I still struggle sometimes, not even sometimes, pretty much most of the time, actually showing up to your webinars. It's the craziest thing in the world. Like
Hmm.
Again,
Oh, right,
I
right. Like, yeah, there's
understand.
something else to do, is
I
it?
un yeah, like I literally I understand this is the most important thing that I could be doing with my time pretty much at any given moment in time, like working on LOI
Mhm.
concepts, and still like to the moments leading up to the webinar, like, oh yeah, but I could be watching this show, or I could be going and talking to a friend or something. Like there's always
Yeah.
this
And it's
general
spring and
feeling
it's the
like
middle of the day now, it's beautiful out and masks are starting to come off.
exactly. It's just this feeling that like my brain gives me that it's not as important as it really is. And
Yeah.
that distinction between my brain and myself and my mind, like it definitely helps to overcome that. And I think that's probably where the key is, like just relying, not even relying, but I guess calling up that understanding where it's like, okay, like it's just my brain's noise essentially.
Yeah. Yeah. I think when I talk about it in these terms up front, I think doing that in alchemy with a defense against a defense type thing, like kind of explicitly acknowledging this kind of deep seated root where, this kind of issue, right, with this fear or defense against even feeling like epistemology matters, like that our brain is trying to tell us it has it handled and doesn't want us to look into it, right?
Yeah,
To find out it doesn't. Kind of explicitly talking about it like we are now, I think, is part of the cure.
I agree. And I think discussion is maybe a big part of that because I mean, there's no one in my life who I
Yeah.
can personally discuss this with, like you mentioned, like when I've
Hmm.
tried to bring this concept up, like there's a very real sense of like we're like talking in circles around each other, like they're squirming away from what I'm trying to say and not even really giving it the thought that's
Hmm.
required. And it's frustrating in real time. So like
Yeah.
this is not only helpful but also very therapeutic in a sense, like just being able
Yeah.
to
Yeah. Excellent. Yeah. And having this series and having you come on, and this way I'm not just talking at you, to my webcam.
yeah.
So beautiful. Peter Turner writes, yeah, that was such an eye opener for me when David treated knowing that he is not his mind really as knowing it and what questions basically need to follow from that. A lot of people have talked about not being their mind, but they basically always switch back to identifying with it because they cannot keep it consistent in their thinking. Yeah, I've talked about that a lot, where you'll hear even James Carey, the comedian, he had some video where he was saying you're not your mind, but it'll come up here and there. But then people kind of like exactly like Peter's saying, and like and echoing what I've said, where people kind of then cheat and they don't use comparative thinking properly and hold it constant and really think through what that means. Dave Mazzaros writes, totally agree with this fear of epistemology thing. I see it in others, but I even feel it when talking about it. Yep, yep. And so I think all of us together now in this hero series, especially, we can kind of confront it with each other, and encourage each other with it, and also encourage each other with trying to figure out how to break through with other people as best as we can, because obviously that's the key. There's some key though, because I managed, like Mike Long and I myself were kind of pleasantly surprised at how much law of implication caught on, right, within OMG and so forth over the last several years. Because first it was just us, Mike and myself, and then starting in 2013, it started to break through, and just a number of people have really, really, taken it very seriously. Bryn says hide and seek water polo without a ball. You're referring to kind of trying to feel like it matters, like at the core. And he says not necessarily fear, but even that the mind can start getting distracted. Exactly right. Like the fear is more like something we don't like feel the fear. It's like I deduce that the fear is there because our mind does everything to try to like keep us from examining its epistemology, right? And ours, and valuing the small things we know, like it's not enough. So it's not like any of us realize we're afraid of it, and we don't feel. Our mind doesn't even give us the feeling of fear. Instead, it gives us something even apparently more effective, right? Just makes us feel distracted and bored. Um, so yeah, beautiful. Dave Keys, it's like a real life George Burns and Gracie Alley skit. Um, Such a showing your age there, Dave. Megan Lisa, such a valuable discussion, so real. Please be recording it. I am recording it. Yep, it says stop recording right there. I have a pretty good habit. Like I start for about a minute and then I hit the recording. So luckily, there's some things where I have mental blocks against remembering in life, but luckily recording is not one of them. Not that it couldn't happen, but I have a pretty good habit at this point. Dave Key says, I love the 2 questions in 2013 that prepared you. You can see the mind's defense play out there. Do you mean one of those was like what if I'm an evil like jerk or something like that? I remember Jason Calori reporting that he had a real, he confronted that, and it was difficult for him. And presumably it is for a lot of people. Joseph says, something that helps me with the LOI is thinking about what I would say if I could come on the webinar, which I'd love to have you, Joseph, if you want to come in one of these. I was thinking about you today, how it might be great to have you on. What I could say if I can come on the webinar live and ask David anything. It reveals where the blurriness, resistance, failure conditions are for me. Wonderful. That's a great question. Great question for other people that might be coming on. And I'd love to have you on, Joseph. So great. Okay. Why don't you start to introduce your thoughts about the main topic having to do with God, consciousness, and so forth, and like kind of where you're at, what your questions might be as you try to like, and it's great because you're willing to. I want you to say, I want you to know that I agree, approve of, respect your attitude of, wait a second, I'm not just going to say I know that God's conscious. I'm going to open up the question, or that God exists, and that sort of thing, and kind of force myself to prove it. Right now, let me remind everyone that proof is not like a series of like what are they called? Do you remember the word I'm trying to refer to here, Lawrence? What is, not propositions, but like axioms is the word I was trying to. It's not like exactly like a proof in geometry or like traditional logic. What it is when you can either see something particularly clearly that you've constructed. Often, if you could see how the opposite is absurd in each case, and so forth. Well, we'll illustrate it as we go, but just not to confuse proof with either a pile of evidence. I think particularly in this day and age in our culture with the internet, with political narratives and stuff, like evidence shows how it's particularly irrelevant in terms of people are sure that they're informed and have evidence for all sorts of things on both sides of opposite conclusions about issues. So just we can write our own narrative regarding evidence pretty easily. So I still live my life and make decisions. So there's plenty of things we have to just act on. That's our best guess, best eyeballing, and then we just try to stand in a place where we can eyeball it reasonably. Then let's also not confuse needing. We don't need to figure out how to know something perfectly in order to act, right? All you need to do is really make a judgment of what you're going to act on and act. There's ways to narrow things down. There's parts of things we can know, but then as a separate matter, whenever we spot something important that we'd like to build, then we can work on building and open up the question. So for example, this question of God. So LOI is very practical in all kinds of things, and this is practical as well, but I'm never trying to tell people that you can't act until you know something, but just that you can get unstuck, you can build things for the future, and ultimately the way to achieve success and mastery is to focus on what you can know and build from there. That becomes something that you kind of understand how to do better and better. It's kind of spot things as you build more things, they kind of come up in more circumstances and so forth. But not that we need to be paralyzed because we don't know everything. Of course, that is not how I operate. Okay, Lawrence, with all that said, kind of get a sense of where you're at and so forth.
I appreciate that, by the way. It's definitely taken me a while to get to this point, but here I am. And so the reason that I wanted to talk about this topic in particular is because I think the context that I could bring to it is kind of unique in a sense, in that I grew up Catholic from when I was very young until I was about 12 or 13 years old. So I believed in God by default for a very long time. I didn't question it. Everyone around me believed, so I believed. At a certain point, I started to question it because a lot of the narratives and a lot of the explanations out there just didn't make a lot of sense to me in particular. But I have always been essentially searching for the truth ultimately. Like
I was the same.
Um, is that it? I don't know if you cut out or not.
Oh yeah, sorry, I might have. I don't know what's with my internet these days. It's kind of weird. I was just saying I was the same age when I questioned things about God.
Okay, cool. It wasn't um as serious in the beginning, but it just as time went on, like less and less started to make sense, and the proof against God became kind of so overwhelming. Not even the proof, but what I believed to be the proof at the time was so overwhelming that it just led me to the point where I was leaning. I'm still agnostic, but I was leaning towards the atheist side of things. But I'm still very much open to wanting to know whether or not God is real. So
Great.
that's essentially where I'm coming from. And your video about God's existence and the proof of God was beautiful, for the lack of better words. But and the parts that so the thing about LOI that and the way that you talk about things that I appreciate so much is that it's kind of irrefutable. Like the way that you explain that there can only be
I'm gonna
one,
turn off my webcam because I don't know what's with my.
that might help. Yeah. But essentially, like one of the main points that I got out of that video and webinar was that there can only be one and exactly one unlimited being in existence or force in existence. And there's the way that you explained it was just so powerful to me that like there was no room for trying to squirm out of that one particular truth. So I understand that there is at least one unlimited being. With the part that I'm having problem with is seeing how it's necessary for God or that force to be conscious at the same time and aware and intentional.
Okay.
You talked about how, and maybe this is part of the reason why it was so difficult for me to really tackle this, was because like the way you talked, like you definitely mentioned it a couple of times in that webinar, how he has to be conscious because he is creating our consciousness screen, and you kind of implied that it should be relatively simple to look at that and see how that doesn't make sense. But because I wasn't able to make sense of it myself, maybe I was a bit hesitant to really try and bring it up. But it's definitely a block for me where I just like for some reason like my brain is just not not passing it. It's like it's stuck at that particular problem.
Okay. So you're, as you describe it, I'm not accusing you of this, but as you describe it, your mind is stuck at. So there's an unlimited being. And so when I say that it has to be conscious to create your consciousness field, and you're wondering maybe like and I'm not at all being sarcastic, but like a magic force or something that has great power, like you might see in a fantasy movie or something, right? Or the universe in some sort can be creating your consciousness field. Like, why does it have to be conscious? How do we know that? Is that what you're saying?
Yes, in part. I guess a secondary question would be just because um God or there's a force that is unlimited, does that mean that that force is also creating anything and everything else that is in existence? I'm
Mhm.
confused with that as well. Like just because God is unlimited in power, how does that translate to him also being responsible for everything? Like it, I feel like I'm mostly understanding why, but I don't fully see the connection there.
Okay, excellent. All right. I was thinking about. I knew that you had questions about this general topic, so I've been thinking about it over the last few days. So I think what a good way to approach this is to suggest that you might be kind of starting in the wrong place, so to speak. In that I discovered this with myself, where um, okay, if we start with consciousness, like the idea of our consciousness screen, like the stuff, like what we're aware of, and we build kind of the world from there, then of course we're doing something very different from uh, we have such our own mind and culturally, there's such a powerful and pervasive different way of building kind of our understanding and model of the world, which is kind of off of this, like the sense of the external world being real in a certain sense, and that we're trying to understand the physical external world, and then consciousness is sort of kind of almost like stuck on top of that model of the world. Like again, the world, normally the way people understand the world, it starts, we all experience it because it's so utterly normal. It's almost odd for me to describe it because it's so normal that it's almost like I'm describing, like, you know, saying the sky is blue or something, and yet it's like wrong. It's wrong. It's not all wrong, but it has a fundamental wrongness to it. It's kind of built off the wrong foundation. So it, like our model for the world based on like starting with the physical world, it is like a model or a metaphor, like a map. And or analogy or whatever, as a model, it works really well, but it utterly breaks down at certain points. Kind of like with Newtonian physics, it utterly breaks down at the quantum level. Or if you're into a movie, you can talk in terms of the movie kind of like basically being real, and you can feel it as real while you're watching it. And that is very useful and effective. And you can, what happened, like if someone's driving down the road in a movie, and then the next second they're still driving down the road, that makes perfect sense, right? If they were walking and then the next second they were driving down the road with no transition where they got into a car, that wouldn't make sense. So in the way that I'm talking about there, you make sense of a movie. There's like a flow in terms of what's in the movie kind of being real in a sense, and that model works really well for understanding the movie. It works well for kind of having a sense of the flow of what you expect to happen next, and your enjoyment and everything. And it works great until it totally breaks down because you're actually watching a movie, and at some point it becomes necessary to understand that it's not fully real. It's just a movie, right? Especially when it's over. Or if there's like someone's watching a 3D movie, or even a normal movie that's 3D for the first time. This is represented in the intro to one of the recent Civilization games, where people are like watching a 3D movie, or like a normal movie, not even a 3D movie, but a movie for the first time, and like a train is coming kind of at them, and they like all dodge out of the way because it's like a whole new thing for them. You know, at some point you want to like understand that it's only real in one sense and not real in another sense, or you know, within the movie there's. So again, the model of the world that we take so for granted that we don't even realize we take it for granted, where we start with the physical world, it feels so correct, but whenever we're trying to think about consciousness, it breaks down entirely, but we don't realize it. And so people will ask a question like, well, how do I know that a tree isn't conscious? Or they'll say, how do we know that other people are conscious? Or maybe a person is not conscious, but we think they're conscious. So they'll ask questions like that, and actually you can't really answer those questions properly unless you realize to totally change the paradigm. Because once you start with a model of the physical world being kind of fundamentally real in a certain way, you can't get to consciousness. It feels like we can, because our mind creates this model of the world where it just sort of gloms it on to the world in this sort of magical thinking way. Like, okay, here's a person, and boom, they're conscious, and we kind of get it because we're conscious, and so we sort of impose that on them, and that works to a decent degree, except when it doesn't. And by the way, one of the simple ways it doesn't work in a very practical way is that we think that our like mind reading of others is way more accurate than it actually is. Like when psychologists measure or like interview people on what they're thinking, and then they talk to like their spouse or someone else they know and what they're thinking, that those will be very different, including the confidence that a person will have that they know what someone else is thinking will be very disproportionate to the confidence they should have. So that has major impacts on people's relationships and all kinds of decisions. And then there's a related thing, where people report the reason for their decision, so to speak, that their mind makes, but that they feel and they agree to the decision. And psychologists have learned over the last few decades, I suppose it is at some point, that you don't ask people why they make a decision unless you're asking for unless you're interested in the story that they make up. But when you ask someone why they make a decision, psychologists now apparently in actual psychologists realize that kind of it's in their culture now is what I'm trying to say. That is, you wouldn't be a professional psychologist if you thought that you're going to get an actual correct answer when you ask someone, well, why did you decide to purchase this rather than something else? Like what people do is when a person's asked a question like that and they answer why they bought something or why they did something, why they lied about something, why they whatever, or you ask them why their political views are such and such, their mind goes and creates kind of a story about why that happened that has nothing to do with the actual subliminal whatever thought process of why it actually happened. Right. And one experiment that I've told you about that is they showed people 4 types of identical fabric and asked which one they preferred. And people would disproportionately prefer the most recent one they looked at, like the final one. And then when asked why, their mind would come up with a story of why they liked that fabric better. And then when they then followed up by asking the people, well, could it be that it was just because it was the most recent fabric you looked at? Then the people, the subject, not the psychologist, the subject, when they would look at the psychologist answering and asking them that like they're crazy, like it was a trick question, or of course that's not why, right? Of course it's not because of the most recent one I looked at. Like, why are you even asking me that? That's kind of weird. And yet empirically it actually was the reason, because they were identical, and yet they disproportionately picked the last one. Okay. Little bit of meandering there, but I'm on purpose talking around this because it's hard for us, and it helps to just kind of talk around it a little bit. We have to kind of get used to this idea. It feels like in the normal model of the world that we have an understanding of consciousness, but minds really don't get consciousness, even though people have the word, it's in our language and so forth. And it's also odd for me to say, in a sense, that you can't answer a question like, how do we know this person's conscious? How do we know that a dog is or isn't conscious? You can't really address it on the level that it's being asked typically. Like, you basically don't know, in a certain sense. Now, okay, so with God, what we need to do to address what you're asking about, Lawrence, is to start by making a paradigm shift. Like, if I try to answer you directly, it kind of won't work like that. And the reason I'm guessing that you're starting in the wrong place, of course, I just mean that like logically, not like critically, is that your kind of question is exactly the type of question, and the kind of confusion associated with the question is exactly the type of confusion that comes when you try to think about consciousness, starting in the kind of the usual place. And even though you've heard me explain things, it's also so much of a habit and so ingrained in our whole view of the world that it's easy to kind of switch between the paradigm, like the kind of correct paradigm where we start with consciousness and build from there, versus the default paradigm where our mind builds the world off of this idea that of a physical world that's kind of a basis for reality. If you want to interject, feel free, but I'll just continue otherwise. So what do I mean then by building off of consciousness? So if we kind of clear our mind of everything and reorient ourselves to the very basic thing of our consciousness screen, we're aware of like what we're aware of in the moment. We are the one that's aware of it. And when I talk about what we're aware of, what seems to be the physical world that I'm looking at, feeling, hearing, and then my kind of mental story, we don't necessarily think of it as a story, but kind of the story that fits, that where when you look at a couch, you don't just see a couch in a physical visual sense, but your mind gives you a bit of a story about the couch, even saying that that's a couch, right? And giving like the word couch is not something you're seeing when you're looking around, but it feels like you're seeing a couch, which is again a word, but there's no word that you're seeing. So your mind kind of superimposes a story, which is useful and helpful. I'm not saying it's a false story, but it's useful to see that we have a story about the world. There's something I'm going to develop with you guys about further in my definitive series. It'll come up about there's so much we can do when we properly understand that our mind creates a story to fit that tries to like fit the facts, and that we can actually rewrite the story as long as it also fit the facts or even fits it better, because sometimes we can do that in a way that's much more useful than the story that's there. And it also, by rewriting things, it also helps us see it as a story that again reinforces that we can adjust parts of it. It gives us more power, more flexibility, more options in a purely very useful practical way, which again I'll develop in the future with you guys. So we're conscious of our consciousness screen. Once we start to think about the world from there, then we're like, all right, well, and again, a lot of this might be a review, but I'm just I need to set this basis in order to address what you're asking. Then we think, all right, so our consciousness screen could be otherwise, or we could ask the question, could our consciousness screen be different than it is? And basically, very obviously, yes. Like it could be just like it's such a, it's a configuration that is what it is. I could be seeing an elephant right now in theory, right? But I'm not, or I could be seeing nothing, or I could, feel differently. I could think differently, whatever. So, and it also could just not be there at all, but instead it's there. So then we start trying to think about what's going on, what's making it, and why. Like, so far, if we really did clear our mind and we're only thinking as far as I've described, then we don't know anything about the physical world. A little bit like what might help understand what I'm saying is if you're looking at a computer game on a screen, you don't know anything directly about the code. You're not looking at the code. You could mistakenly feel like you're looking at the world if you're looking at a computer screen, or if you're hooked up to a really comprehensive virtual reality, right? And instead of seeing what you think of now as the real world, like your real room and whatever that you're in, and you're seeing like a kitchen or let's say it's a soccer field, all right, that's virtual reality, and it was totally comprehensive, where tactile and auditory and visual. You're sitting in your room, let's say right now in real life, so to speak, but you're seeing a soccer field. So through virtual reality, then you're not seeing the code and you're not seeing the real world, but you are seeing something, and that something is based on something, because there's a coherence to it, right? It's a soccer field one moment, and the next moment it's still a soccer field, right? Because that's another way that our consciousness screen in theory could be. And again, when I say in theory, it could be, again, we're trying not to impose all of our knowledge about the world, so to speak, our whole model of the world on what I'm building right now. I'm trying to build very minimally. So there could be a total incoherence too in our conscious experience. One moment to the next could be totally random. You can imagine a virtual reality that does this, where 1 second you're on a soccer field, the next second you're on a plane, the next second you're swimming, right, or whatever, or you're just in a different soccer field, you're in a baseball field, whatever, right? Every moment is disconnected from another moment, right? And maybe there's some controls in some way, but the controls have nothing to do with what you're seeing, right? So maybe there's a virtual reality and you have a body that can move around, but as you start to take a step forward on the soccer field, all of a sudden you're sitting in the cockpit of a plane. And so your actions of like your avatar in that world, which you think of it, which is like feels like your physical body, right, in that world, don't have any connection to what you actually experience the next moment. That could be the case, right? And that could be programmed. Okay, so if we realize that, then all right, so now let's go back to our actual experience of the world. So here we are, and we, based on our entire lives and the model and what we take for granted, we feel like we're our bodies, our mind, and we're walking around in the real world, and we learn about the real world. We might think about it and think about consciousness, but it's all kind of, if we think about consciousness, we'll kind of rapidly get lost, right? Pretty much. Or we won't feel like we'll get lost because our mind just kind of gives us a pat story and we don't really question it. So we are lost, but we either feel lost or we don't when it comes to thinking about it. If we reorient ourselves to stopping jumping to conclusions about the world and instead just keep it at our consciousness screen, then we can ask, well, why are we seeing this consciousness screen? Well, if there's a coherence to the consciousness screen, then there would have to be some sort of reason for that coherence. If it feels like there's a real world out there, then that's interesting. Okay, so there's a conclusion or a feeling, right, that there's a real world. I'm really in a real physical room, right? I'm in a house that has other rooms right now that are real physical. They look a certain way. That all is how things seem. And there's a coherence to that. Like if I were to test it in a sense and go to another room, there it would be, right, presumably. But if we ask the right questions, and here's another key, is to think accurately. We need to do something that is illustrated well in certain mystery novels, right? Like I talk about with Hercule Poirot ones or certain Sherlock Holmes ones and so forth, where there's a whole kind of two paradigms about anomalies. What our mind does is kind of create a model and a story about the world. And when anomalies pop up, the first reaction of our minds is to marginalize, delete, diminish, not notice the anomalies. Just like you can imagine the kind of stupid version of the policeman, right? There's usually like some kind of counterpoint to the detective, or not usually, but sometimes at least there's a counterpoint to the smart detective, where you have a policeman or his assistant or so on, sidekick, that's kind of comes up with a theory and a story about why the murder happened, and then anything that doesn't fit into that story is sort of dismissed or explained away, or oh, why are you so, the guy might say to the smart detective, well, why are you so obsessed with the cufflinks, right, or something like that, like big deal, right? Or oh, that's funny, why do you have to complicate things? Instead, we need, the smart detective is always the one that pays close attention to anomalies, even if they look pretty small, because it's almost like they're trying to break through, right? When you're trying to have a breakthrough, you need to pay attention to anomalies. They matter. They might not matter, but they might. And so if the basic method or process of saying, oh, well, that doesn't really matter, or diminishing an anomaly is going to prevent our breakthrough. It's kind of like, reminds me of like door-to-door sales. You need to knock on doors. You can't just say, oh, this person probably won't be home, because you're not going to make any sales unless you knock on the doors, right? Or whatever the internet version of that type of thing is. If you don't take action, right, you won't have success. If you don't value and pay attention to anomalies and respect them and let them break your paradigm or your box that you're in, then you can't have breakthroughs. So a person who dismisses anomalies might look smart in the sense that they saved themselves knocking on the doors that wouldn't be home, right? If someone who was like a skeptic or whatever was like, hey, look, this is not worth it, why would you knock on this door? It looks like they're not home. Then the guy knocks on the door and they're not home. They're like, see, I told you so, right? But again, that skeptic, ultimately, their method is not going to make them any sales, right? You have to keep knocking on doors until you make a sale. Similarly, you have to keep valuing anomalies. That's going to be critical as we look at the proof of God. And also your attitude, Lawrence, of, well, I want to prove this. I don't want to just say like, okay, well, sure, I can just kind of make the leap of faith without telling myself that, yeah, I know it, and so great. So that's part of it too that you're doing. I mean, a very simple answer that I'm trying not to limit myself to is, well, or at least what I'm trying to get to explaining is that like in a fantasy movie, you can have a magic crystal that has magical powers and it could like create stuff, right? But in reality, that's a contradiction. You can't, without consciousness, consciousness is fundamental. You can't cause something or have reasons to cause it without first being conscious. And so what I'm trying to do is build, like we'll figure out where you're stuck by I'm kind of like building from step one and building until we figure out, or either we just build it correctly and you get there, and or we kind of figure out where you're stuck or that sort of thing. Like, I don't know, right? It's like any kind of diagnostic thing where you're like, all right, first reset your computer, right? Then do the next thing, check your whatever config file. So we're like, resetting the computer and then building from there. So if I'm like just thinking about my conscious screen, I'm not jumping to, of course I'm gonna feel like there's a real world, but I'm gonna remind myself that, or a real external world. Like again, it doesn't feel like you're looking at and experiencing a consciousness screen. That's why it's even hard for me to explain what I mean by consciousness screen at first. Most everyone on this webinar has experience hearing me talk about it, probably several times or many times. But of course, people ultimately in the future watching on a replay may not. Who knows? But it doesn't feel like you're looking at a conscious screen. It feels just like if you're really wrapped up in a movie, it doesn't feel like a movie, right? It feels like it's real in the moment. Of course, if someone stopped you and said, "Are you watching a movie?" you'd say yes in that case. In real life, then people can't stop you and say, "Wait, of course you know this. You're just looking at your conscious screen. You're experiencing your conscious screen, not actual external reality." They would say, "Well, I don't know what you mean," right? But it's the same thing. You're aware of your conscious screen. You feel like you're aware of the external world, but you're not. You're aware of what you're aware of, and that's not the same. It's again, it's the analogy of, it's kind of like you can see a computer screen, but and you can play a game on a computer, but you're not seeing the code. What you're seeing is related to the code when you're playing a game and looking at the world that's created on your screen of the game. But you, like if you're playing, let's say, a baseball game, right, on your computer, like a computer baseball game, you see a field, a baseball diamond, and all that stuff, but you're not, of course, you understand that you're not looking at the code, you're looking at something that's related to the code. It's not even created just by the code, or the code could create it whenever it wanted. It's created as the code interfaces with the computer and the processing and all that, right? Interestingly enough, the code is not aware of the computer screen, right? And that's a little bit of a metaphor. Metaphors break down at some points, they're not perfect, but the fact that the code is not aware of the screen, even though it's very relevant for what's on the screen, right? In a certain similar way, your mind and your brain is not aware of your consciousness field, right? Your brain doesn't see what you see, and yet it's very responsible for what you see. Again, in a certain sense, similar to code not being able to see what's on the computer screen, and yet it's very responsible for it. And neither can the processing of the computer, like the RAM and so forth. The RAM doesn't see what's on the screen, and yet the RAM is processing and deciding, in a certain sense, what's on the screen. Crazy, right? But without seeing the screen. So it processes on a different level. It feels to you like you see what's going on and make decisions based on it. But interestingly enough, what's really going on is your mind is somewhat metaphorical. It's not a perfect metaphor, but there's a lot of overlap that can start to help us see. Your mind is like the processing of a computer that can't see the computer screen, and yet still processes a precursor to what's on the computer screen in order to create what's on the computer screen. It's as if the computer like sees what's on there, and then the physics works, right? Like it looks like if it's a baseball game on a computer, like a computer baseball game, it looks like the bat will hit the ball, and the force of the bat and the angle will hit the ball, right? And that's how far the ball will go. But the physics is all simulated, right? There's not real physics. And again, the real world actually works similarly. Physics in real life is actually analogous to a physics engine, that in essence God is upholding. So some of your questions had to do with, how do we know that this force or this unlimited thing that creates stuff, how do we know it's conscious? And then why does it have to keep creating every moment?
Yes.
So if we try to imagine something, there's an issue with how we think that the cause can happen that we need to rewire. Like we call all sorts of things causes within our model of the world, right? Like our model of the world, the baseball bat can hit the ball, and the swinging of the bat and the hitting the ball, and we can say certain forces and so forth make the ball travel in the angle that it's going. And we might say it's physics that caused it. We might say it's the angle of the bat, the muscles of the skill of the computer, of the not computer, but the baseball player, the real baseball player. And it's interesting, in conversation, we can reasonably say that it was the skill of the baseball player, and take that for granted. Like, wow, that's amazing how skillfully that baseball player is, right? We could say that and it'd be reasonable. And we could also say that physics is the reason. If there's a physics teacher teaching about baseball, I'd say physics is the reason why the ball travels where it does, and here's the physics involved, right? And if you change the material of the bat, then then it will. So we're used to talking about causality in those terms, and once we're in that model of physics and the world, and physics being kind of fundamental, and the physical world being kind of fundamental, then we're in a place where we're going to descend into nonsense every time we try to think about consciousness. If we can isolate our thinking to our consciousness screen, then okay, so let's try to look at the opposite. If we're thinking, all right, well, something has to be capable of making consciousness screens. And then there also have to be separately like reasons why my conscious screen is one way rather than another, including why there's a coherence, there's a flow to my conscious screen rather than it being random from one moment to the next.
And does it have to be a
If we
singular?
imagine something non-conscious, it's aware of nothing. Which the God figure?
Sorry, you're kind of breaking up a little bit on
You
my
might be
end.
talking, I don't hear you.
Can you
Okay.
hear me now?
It might be me. But the God figure, is that who you're referring to? How do we know it's one, or would you?
Oh no, you mentioned that there has to be a cause to what we're experiencing in our consciousness screen. But
Right.
does that have to be a singular entity, or like is it possible that there's just a certain, like, kind of how we talk about alchemy, like is it possible that there just happens to be a particular combination of all these different components that just so happen to create consciousness in the way that it is, that allow us to experience what we're seeing in our consciousness screen at any given moment, as opposed to just a singular force or entity that's creating it at any given moment, indefinitely? Why does it have to be a singular being?
Okay. So you're saying, can there be a number of things, for lack of a better word, that in concert are collectively responsible for our consciousness field being the way it is? Or am I still breaking up?
Yes. Yeah. That's pretty much it.
Okay. Well, this is where the how do I break this down? So we have cause, we have unlimited. God, there's a different ways to approach this, but one thing we could start with, that to tease this apart, we could say, can God delegate? And now that would still be I understand that I'm jumping to God existing right there when I say, can God delegate? But it's still a useful question to ask. Like, can God delegate? I had a mental exercise that I've used. I'm sure I mentioned at some point, but maybe years ago. As I was figuring this stuff out, what I did was I imagined this. I said, what if God, and none of these are like arguments or evidence, they're pieces that kind of help us build stuff. Okay. So what if I imagine I'm God and I'm the only causal being in existence? Again, this is a mental exercise.
Yeah.
It's not assuming anything. It's creating it's a stipulation, mental exercise. And so that's perfectly permissible. So I imagine I'm God. I'm the only being that can cause anything. And again, I'm stipulating that just for the sake of a mental exercise. And then I create an earth. And on that earth, there's water flowing. And like where you kind of take that for granted, how water just flows in rivers. Or there's an apple that drops. Now, when I think about that, could that stuff just happen if I'm God, if I'm the only causal being out there? And I make an earth. Well, actually nothing could move, not even a molecule or an atom, unless I made it move, right? Now I could, in one sense, delegate, but how would I even do that? Like I could, if I either make something, I could say, like we might say with words, well, couldn't I just say, let the water flow? Well, but what does that mean? And who's there to hear it, right? Like you still would have to make every piece move each, whatever the moments were, or each individual discrete moment in time. You couldn't just say, there's no one to hear you, right? You can't just say, okay, river, start flowing and just keep flowing. You have to do each thing because I stipulated that. You're the only causal being. My stipulation doesn't make anything true. It's just, it still helps us think.
Right. That's actually really cool. So so you're saying that there
Are you
is no
following
way.
that stipulation, or is it losing you?
Yeah, completely. So basically you're saying that God cannot, there is no way that any being, even God, can create something that works on an ongoing basis without
Yeah,
consistently having to essentially create it at any given moment. Is that what you're saying?
right. And that now, not yet. You can't do it in one. You can't do it in one logical leap. What we could ask is, well, can you create something that could do it for you, right? Of course, we can ask that next. But like certainly until and unless you possibly create something that could do it for you, then you'd have to make every individual thing move that did move. Then we can ask, well, what would it look like to make something that could start to take over some of that work for you, so to speak, right? And thinking through that is enlightening, because let's say you wanted the water to just flow in a river, or the tree to grow without you having to do it yourself. When you ask how would you actually go about doing it, right into an interesting puzzle where you pretty much have to make an algorithm, right? Like if you let someone else do it, you either give them like free will, like a person that can also make water flow, right? Like kind of like a demigod, but you either give them free will in some sense, in which case you're not making sure the water will flow because they can choose not to, or you're basically making an algorithm. You can make it look like a demigod, but you fully are programming it, right? If it doesn't have free will, then that means it's literally like an algorithm. So it doesn't matter that it's supposedly a demigod, it's just an algorithm, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And it's really hard for us to picture these things, instantly picture these things, because we're so used to things like having whims. Like what I mean is, so when we try to think about God, and we're also so used to the world just happening, that like where water just can flow, right? Like without us trying, or we make a computer and the computer does stuff, or we put stuff in the laundry machine and the laundry machine does stuff. We're so used to that happening that it helped me to get outside of that by imagining being like a God that was the only thing that could make anything, and forcing myself to think through how that would work. And again, it got me outside of those assumptions. And a God also can't just have whims. They don't just have feelings like I feel like doing this or I feel like doing that.
So
So
funnily enough, I'm able to see this pretty clearly, and it makes perfect sense. So
great.
maybe the part that
It is actually what helped me tremendously to think this through.
maybe the part that I'm actually stuck on is the fact that God is the cause for everything. Like I don't
Mm-hmm.
see how the jump from unlimited power necessarily means that it is also the cause of everything. Is it possible that, like, maybe it goes back to the creation of God, which may not make sense. I don't know if God is a being that.
No, God wasn't created by another God. God
Right,
has his
that
own
doesn't
being.
make any sense. So like
Yeah.
maybe that's the area where I'm stuck at. Like I don't see how necessarily the fact that he is unlimited
Uh-huh.
leads to him being the cause of everything.
Okay. So God, of course, as you've heard me say many times, God doesn't choreograph everything, but God does have to make your consciousness field because there's nothing else that can make your consciousness feel. Now you could say, well, David, that like maybe that's a leap. Why am I just kind of asserting that there's nothing else that can make it? So,
Right.
but if we start with God, so if we start with our consciousness field, something has to be making it. Then we
Yes.
can realize that there can be only one being of unlimited power that exists. Because of course, if there's two, then you'd find out real quick which one, the minute they disagreed, which one was unlimited and which one was. And so now you have one being that has the final say over what goes into your consciousness field. So then the only issue would be, can God make intermediates? Like these intermediates couldn't just spring into being outside of God's power, or if that makes any sense. Like there can't be beings that just run around totally outside of God's knowledge and power that are like doing stuff in your consciousness field. Does that make sense? Like there's no limit to God's knowledge and power. So any intermediates or extra components or demigods or angels or whatever, they can't just be operating like totally independently. They can't like spring from nothing and be outside of God's power and knowledge. If that makes sense.
Right. Anything and everything would be happening because God is essentially allowing it to happen.
Allowed, exactly. Okay, great. So now we're at the point where the only way that there could be other things making stuff is if God basically created them, like kind of made them. Like you could say allowed them, but it all amounts to the same thing. Because if they spontaneously generated, God's still allowing it. So they would still have to at least be logically consistent. Like they have to be able to logically exist, is all I'm saying, right?
Okay.
So we would just have to identify what could that look like, what could logically exist. And it relates to what I just said. Either it has total free will, not even total, sorry. Either it has some amount of free will, or it doesn't. Right? Like let's say there's angels/demons that can kind of put stuff in your consciousness field outside of God's authority in a certain sense. I guess God could stop them. We just agreed that God could stop them. Not that agreeing makes something true, but I think you saw how God could stop them because he's unlimited in power. If we say God can't stop this particular angel/demon, then we would be contradicting something that we can prove, which is that there's specifically one unlimited power being.
Which I love that, by the way. It's just so clear. But yeah, go ahead.
Thank you. You love that proof. There has to be one. Yeah, exactly. And people don't realize that. Of course, lots of people believe it, but they don't know how. So, all right. So, like Satan, for example, I'm not saying Satan. I'm saying if we imagine, just take for a fun, just as an illustration, Satan would either have to have free will or not. Free will means that Satan could also choose to basically stop being Satan, right? So, which is interesting. If we say Satan does have free will, then it's still going to be limited. It can't be unlimited. So God could say, all right, within these bounds, I'm not going to overrule you. God still could in power wise, but God has now created a rule that's kind of like analogous to a rule of physics. And God actually does do that with us, right? We have a limited amount of free will. If we didn't have that, we couldn't literally make any choices. We couldn't love, therefore, right? And then that, the whole reason why we have the flawed world that we have is basically a consequence of needing to make beings, the fact that beings that could love, there could be more goodness overall than if we just had beings that were in a state of like drug-induced bliss. We can kind of prove that in one sense, and also since it's what God chose, it has to be the right decision because God's not deceived. Anyway, so we're kind of back to something like a person, except that maybe they can directly put things in people's consciousness field. Now, the funny thing is we can affect what's in each other's consciousness fields, right? Like if I walk up to someone and punch them in the face, then I'm imposing that upon their consciousness field. I'm not directly capable of creating or changing their consciousness field, but at the same time, I sort of am, right? By a couple of things. So there's really not that much different from like an angel or demon that could directly broadcast a message like, hey, I'm Satan, or go cheat on your wife, or a feeling like, let's say Satan could like intensify. Let's say you see an attractive woman and without Satan you would feel like, oh, she's attractive, but I'm not going to try to cheat on her. And then somehow she's hitting on you, and she's interested. And then let's say Satan could kind of push you over the edge or kind of give you a nudge, right? So now Satan's kind of operating directly in a consciousness field. Now, again, people could do something super similar to that, right, and encouraging something or saying, oh, come on, what are you, chicken, or what are you, some kind of straight lace, right? So it's pretty similar to what a person can already do. But if Satan could do that, then God would just create a situation where people can do that. Then now Satan can do it. And I'm in no way saying this is actually happening. I'm just as a mental exercise. So no, I can't prove that God doesn't have angels or whatever running around that can nudge things in consciousness fields. It seems like that might be within God's purview, but God would specifically allow a certain amount of power that would be limited, just like with ourselves. And it's even hard to identify exactly what the limits of our power are, right? We're not presented with a user manual and told, okay, you have this much power, you're not allowed to go past it, but there's just certain limits. We can have a certain type of thing we can basically turn on or off, and then there's consequences of that. So basically, but the only reason is, as far as I can tell, to give any being free will is for it to choose God and love and goodness, which actually flows from seeking understanding rather than rubber stamping your brain's false sense of certainty. There wouldn't be a reason for God to give supposed free will, and yet the free will isn't to create more goodness. We could maybe work at that, but on first glance, that seems like it would have to be, where again, the free will would only be in the realm of, like, anything that God did literally is to create the abundance, the possibility of abundance, the possibility of more goodness, or even the inevitability of it, given enough time, of more goodness.
That's actually another question that I had,
Yeah.
apart from the consciousness part, is stipulating that God does exist, that he's unlimited and he is conscious. Why is it not possible or unlikely that he isn't what we would consider to be evil or indifferent?
Because God would not be able to be deceived. So being deceived and having whims is something we kind of take for granted as possible for our own experience. But God again can't be deceived. Like, God knows whatever is, right? If something doesn't exist, like the future, God might not know it, right? God could say, I'm going to do such and such in the future, but God, like, whenever something's unlimited, it can't exist. So there's things that people might think that God would know that God actually doesn't, because it's a contradiction in terms. Like, God doesn't know what a married bachelor looks like, not because God's stupid or limited, but because there's, it's a nonsense phrase. Anyway, so when God's not deceived, and therefore God, in a certain sense, doesn't have a choice. God's going to see what would lead to the most goodness, but I don't mean in the future where things are within our free will. Like, God can't necessarily see what we're going to do, interestingly enough.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be a surprise to people, because a lot of people think, that God can see things that are, again, that end up being contradictional terms. But in terms of what's logically the correct decision, God would only pick the good one. And so if God were indifferent, God couldn't have as much goodness, and neither could we. Versus, like, wanting other people to have more goodness is better for the wanter, not just for the person experiencing the goodness. Like, the same is true for us, where if I don't care about other people, sure, that'll insulate me from some pain in this world right now, but it puts a limit, like a governor or whatever, like a limit on how much goodness I can experience, because I can't get anything except for my own, like, pleasure, basically, or my own anticipation of what might be in the future, which might be labeled differently, happiness or joy and different things. But I'm limited to, like, my own sense of what's going to happen to me and what is happening to me. If I can care about others, then I can add goodness to that. That's neutral. So I just kind of crossed off the neutral thing. Now, how about God actively wanting other people to suffer, or separately a person? They're two different things, but they can help us. One can help us see the other. So if you have any person who wants other people to suffer, then you run into, again, logical problems with a ceiling on how much goodness they can have. Because if, like, I need you to suffer for me to feel good, then I can't have as much goodness as if I can feel goodness independently, first of all, and then like I have to kind of feel that you're suffering in order to feel good. So I imagine the suffering and then feel good from it. And also, I'm now spreading a meme that we want others to be as worse off as possible, which isn't great for me because now other people would have to want the same thing from me, you know.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's fairly simple to dismiss once so forth. So we start to take a look at like people. I don't think anyone would really seriously consider that it's a better choice, you know, for God to want everyone to suffer versus want everyone to be better off. Okay, so how's that for addressing what you're asking?
Yeah, no,
And some of this you can
yeah.
further think of later. Again, you can kind of borrow what I'm saying for the moment, or I can point you in a direction.
It's
I'm not
making
trying
sense.
to like convince you or get you to agree right now that every breakthrough.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, so it's making sense. I'm not fully there yet on that, but I think
Yeah.
it's making enough sense where I can think about it on my own from there.
Good, like I'm kind of at least I'm addressing what you're saying. Like I'm hearing what you're saying and addressing it.
Yes.
Or is there anything I'm not, or dodging by accident, or kind of misinterpreting?
No, I
Nothing.
think
Nothing.
we're speaking the same language. We're good.
Okay, great. Okay, super. All right, I'll give this a few minutes with looking at what people are saying, and then we'll wrap up the webinar in about 10 minutes or less, probably. Famous last words. Dave writes, let's see here. Dave Keyes said, I started down the path of how do you know the Bible is true in a Facebook discussion and pointed out the fallibility of the Council of Nicaea, and a person went off on me and referred to me to an apologetics book that is laden with weakness from start to finish. Never mind those 300 guys behind the curtain. Yeah, exactly. And yeah, like Paul can be awesome, but it just doesn't make a lot of, yeah, you've heard me say this, like basically Paul didn't call himself God, so deciding that Paul is God gets a little bit ridiculous. Like the Council of Nicaea did a very good job, we could say, relative to what they could have done in picking good, like you're picking Paul and Jesus's direct followers and brother, and so forth. That's a good idea for people that are great to read. Like Paul certainly is worth taking seriously, but infallible is very different. And then there's, some specific things that Paul said, namely with respect to homosexuals and with respect to obeying authorities, and authorities are put in place by God and so forth that can lead to a very bad place. So Dave says, but I'm not trying to undermine Paul, but just say that Paul's not God. Plus, we're a better witness to people that, for example, might be Muslim who can legitimately say, well, what's the difference between following Muhammad as like a divinely inspired prophet versus you guys follow Paul, right? Okay. Dave Key says, especially with the ending of this series Lost, it works until it doesn't. Yeah, that's pretty fun. Sterling says, if you find a watch, you wouldn't think the watch made itself, neither. Yeah, exactly like Paley talked about. I'm a little careful about like kind of reasoning things from analogy though, because it doesn't work quite as well for people, nor quite should it. So you're right, and in this case, the analogy does hold actually, like it's a correct analogy. But the interesting thing is about analogies and metaphors is you can't know they're correct unless you can independently find out that when I say correct, you can't tell when an analogy or a map or a model or a metaphor overlaps with that which it's a metaphor for, like the underlying reality, until and unless you have an independent way of looking at both the analogy and the underlying reality. So I've talked before about how analogies are great for as a teaching tool and an explanatory tool when you understand, like let's say you're teaching chemistry or physics and you're teaching a concept that you understand the underlying chemistry, you understand the analogy that you're using. Like in the case of electricity, water running through pipes might be a good metaphor for teaching electricity, except for when it breaks down. But if you understand electricity very well, I'm not saying I do, by the way, but if you do, and then you understand, kind of the metaphor of water running through pipes, then you can use that as a teaching tool because you know the extent to which those two overlap. But if you're trying to prove or understand something that you don't yet fully understand, or you're trying to teach someone, you're trying to prove something to someone, you can't use an analogy to prove something. You can use it to illustrate something. And again, because again, the analogy doesn't stand on its own. It only works when someone independently understands the underlying reality and the analogy and can therefore see where they do overlap and where it breaks down. So be careful about trying to prove something with analogy. You might convince someone with an analogy, but then you're kind of reinforcing the wrong type of epistemology. So be careful. Please choose the best answer. Dave says, I was struggling to understand why some things seemed really simple and obvious, yet it seemed hard for people to get them. And I realized it must be related to people starting in a different place. That's beautiful. It's exactly right. That's how it is always. And always, if something seems obvious to you and you wonder how someone else could be so stupid, so to speak, or you're feeling that, then yeah, it's your starting place. And like I talked about, you need to have like a shared currency, or if you're trying to figure out whether the New York Giants or the New York Mets are which one's a better team, then you'd need some, if one's football, I believe they're still New York, maybe one's New Jersey at this point, or whatever, who knows, I haven't followed for a while. So my sports knowledge is from like the 80s and early 90s. But anyhow, if one's a football team and one's a baseball team, then the only way to get straight on who's a better team, if you cared about doing that, you'd have to create some shared playing field, some shared game that for some good reason would determine that, right? Or at least if you're trying to have agreement with a particular person on who's a better team, you would have to discuss with them until you come up with a shared standard that you both agree on, right? Just like if one person has Japanese won, I think yen, and then if another person has euros, then in order to exchange those, you'd have to agree on a shared currency or a base currency that you can measure them both against, right? Bryce says, I've been tossing and turning about which graduate engineering school to get my master's. Congratulations on doing that. You got it. Congratulations on being accepted. Good job, Cornell, Berkeley. Sounds like you're doing pretty well, Bryce, for yourself. I decided to go with Illinois because it's affordable. I'm just looking to get my stable base. Yep, great. Regarding what Megan mentioned last time, do you believe this whole school prestige thing useless to look into? I think school prestige matters and I don't mean this trivially, as far as it matters, like it's like how you dress when you go to any type of place, business meeting, party, even do a webinar. If I have my webcam on, I just turned it off because my internet, I need to at least reset my router and see how that works, and then otherwise maybe do something different. But how you dress matters relative to where you're going and what you're trying to get out of it and so forth, right? So if you ask, well, does it really matter to dress a certain way to a business meeting? Well, yeah, it may well, relative to what your goals are and so forth. So school prestige certainly matters within where it matters, and there is a realm in which it does matter. You might ultimately have great success in life by ignoring various things that might matter, right? You could theoretically make a ton of money dressing casually to business meetings, but it also might hold you back, or it might be a big advantage to dress in line with what they expect, just depending on other factors. So that's my answer to that. But just because it doesn't matter in some ways of thinking doesn't mean it doesn't matter in others. Just like going to college in the first place, right? Like if you want to actually be a doctor or a lawyer or a number of professional things, you just literally have to go to college. I don't believe there's any legal way to or rewire society, majorly. But yeah, like if someone said to me, I want to be a doctor and practice in America, should I go to college? I'd say yeah. Right, of course you have to. Yeah, that's correct, Dave, about of course the batter and the ball, exactly. But it feels like you're seeing it, but you don't, and you have to start swinging before you can really process the visual ball. So that's a further good analogy and things. Anything else referring to what we were talking about before? Be a leap to a new one being with unlimited power, correct? If something is greater than your consciousness that is not conscious itself, that is absurd because you already know you're conscious. I don't get into the greater thing like that Thomas Aquinas talked to. It's not that it's wrong. It's just like not that something has to be greater specifically. It's that it has to be capable. If your consciousness field exists where it otherwise theoretically couldn't, and it also that it has a rhyme and reason to it, whereas it also doesn't have to have that. There just has to be something capable of making it, rather than saying greater or not. That's kind of a blurry word to me. It's not that it's wrong. It's just I feel like it's unnecessary blurry. Talk about greater. And so the whole Aquinas, one of his basically all of his proofs, I feel like are unnecessarily blurry. And he himself admitted that he started with kind of saying that he knew that God exists and then was trying to prove it. Like it was a little bit starting in the wrong place, even though he was very close. I mean, he did a great job, except for not quite good enough. So if you define great as quite good enough, that he didn't. In the world of things or reasons, Megan writes, does it make sense that God can put some process on autopilot with algorithms? Yeah, well, see, when God makes an algorithm, there's no difference between God just doing it and God supposedly making a thing doesn't have, like, to give an angel the power to make water run. You'd have to give it the power to like not make it run. If that, like, it's easy to like picture, like I say, like the world the way we're used to. But if you stop and think about being God as the only thing and then start to build from there, then you start to realize, well, what am I going to do? Like make an angel that can make the water run, but that the angel has no free will to not make the water run. So now what is that angel doing? I mean, you're basically, what's the difference in that and just doing it yourself? It's a little odd to imagine how it is being God, so you can't like do it perfectly, but and I also don't really see a great use except for if someone has a stumbling block with it, but for trying to figure it out, perfectly. But I don't, like you, and I don't think God does intervene necessarily in the algorithm. I think there's just more algorithm that we're not quite aware of somehow, because God again can't have whims in the way that we have. God can't just like feel like doing something and therefore do it. There has to be kind of, I don't know, like it gets a little bit, it feels like I understand it, but you can work it through yourself. None of these, I don't want to like die on the hill of certain, kind of deep things like this. Great questions and totally worth working through for yourself. I feel pretty good about where I'm at with it, rightly or wrongly. Suleiman says, David, omniscience of God is fundamental. So how can we say God will depend on creation to know what they will do? Who wants to believe in that kind of God? God is beyond time and space. I don't really talk about it in terms of, oh, God's beyond time and space. Like the thing with the future is it doesn't actually exist. It's like, can God create a stone that's too heavy for God to lift? Well, basically no, because it's just a nonsense phrase. Like it just refers to a contradiction. The future doesn't exist. The future, like the phrase the future, in the way that people think of it, often refers to a contradiction. There is a real concept of the future, but it's a little bit like the difference between an unlimited set of numbers, like the whole number or the natural numbers is like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, ... right? It's like their whole number is starting with 1. The set of whole numbers, it just includes 0. Same thing. So you can write it as an unbounded series, but that can be useful. It can have uses to refer to the natural numbers in some way, but the natural numbers don't exist in the sense of all of them. What that refers to, that unbounded set, they all, another way to put it is they all can't exist. So the future exists as a certain type of concept, but it doesn't exist. It's not like God's outside of time and space, so he sees all the future, just like God can't see all the natural numbers. And to repeat that, God cannot write out or look at or be aware of all of the natural numbers, the unbounded set, 1, 2, 3, etc. God can't do that. That's not because God's limited in power or in knowledge. It's because it refers, all the natural numbers, that phrase, it refers to something that can't exist. It does not exist. It's words put together on both sides of a contradiction. It doesn't refer to anything real. And the future is the same way. And for God to create free will, God can't choreograph things. And how can God know what we're going to do? And you can think that through if you want. And if you have reasoning that you want to build onto mine or correct me, great. But just saying, who wants to believe in that type of God? I mean, first of all, that's, it's not really about what we want to believe. You say, how can we say God will depend on creation to know what they will do? Yeah, I mean, God does depend on us, but that's what's beautiful is there's a certain inevitability of success. right, about God's plan. So in that sense, it doesn't depend on us. I mean, there's a sort of an analogy. Of course, I don't never equating myself to God in any way, shape, or form. But if I'm doing what I do for projects with business, I design things in a way where success is essentially inevitable in a certain sense. But the other people that are part of the project can very legitimately say the success depended in significant part on me and what I did and my talent, right? Like obviously Mike Long does a lot of real stuff to make things work, and things wouldn't work without him on various business projects that I do. But at the same time, I design them for inevitable success. But it's nice for Mike in a vacuum. It's not why I do it, of course, and I'm not God, et cetera. But in addition to everything else, it's nice for Mike to feel correctly that he did something real. So no, God really does depend on us for goodness, because if you, for example, don't seek understanding in a certain realm, and therefore bad, evil stuff ends up happening by default, like and when I say evil stuff, like kind of violating contradictions get acted on, right? Because someone didn't seek understanding. God was depending on that person to seek understanding to have more goodness. The person in that case was not worth depending on, but it was necessary for God to depend on them in order for them to have free will and have the possibility of that goodness. So, we couldn't participate meaningfully in creation if God didn't, in the way, if you're saying, depend on us. So no, I mean, it comes down to us. My son, who's 8 and turning 9 soon, we were fighting the Ender Dragon in Minecraft, if you know what that is. And Jason Calori participated, and his son. And I ended up blowing myself up on a final crystal that had to be blown up before we could actually kill the dragon, otherwise it would regenerate. And then they ended up dying because we hadn't prepared enough for them, enough slow falling potions. So Chance, my son, was the last one left. The dragon was nearly dead. And then I said, Chance, it's up to you, because if you don't kill it, then I probably won't get my stuff back and everything. So it's all on you. And he said that first he was like in a panic and kind of confused, but then when he heard that, he like felt brave, and he actually succeeded. He defeated it, and things turned out well. So again, in that case, we depended on him, but that gave him the opportunity to participate very meaningfully in a real way, and it meant something to him. That's just a story that illustrates. It doesn't prove anything, but it illustrates that thing. So no, God, weirdly enough, does depend on us. But the reason I told that story is that can also, confronting that truth can motivate us. Like when Bill Clinton was reelected in around '96, I think it was. It meant something to me. I realized that evil could win, right? And by the way, that the whole crisis, right? My dad wrote a whole book on this that'll come out soon. The whole crisis, the terrible credit crisis, in 2007 and 2008, that all came from, it was in practice, the fulcrum point. There was a lot of contributions, but it was Bill Clinton's policy. And so I realized that it could be up to me. Like as far as I was concerned, it was up to me, because life wasn't like the Transformers or the A-Team where the good guys always won, right? Like so, and that galvanized me and made me take things seriously. It's the same thing for you, right? From your perspective, it can be very galvanizing, and for a lot of you might feel that way. It could be up to you. So, or in a certain sense, it is. Any one person can assure success. That's how it is in the whole, of existence. But it's up to people. In addition to, God created the conditions for it, but God also made it so we can, and therefore, and need to. God couldn't make it so we could participate without us needing at least one person to create the chain reaction that's going to do it. I don't talk about God. I mean, we're outside of time and space as much as God's outside time and space, and we can't see the future, right? Like to just say that, oh, God's outside time and space, it's technically true in a certain sense, but it's also not quite true in another sense. God's creating consciousness fields, for everyone right now. And he hasn't created all the future consciousness fields, or else we wouldn't have any free will. Oh, you're very welcome for that tip with the analogy that I talked about a few minutes ago. So great. Okay, I'm going to end the webinar here. Thank you hugely, Lawrence, for coming on.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate everyone who showed up. And I did want to say that I very much plan on being one of those people who will be here to lift you up if for whatever reason you and your family go through like a rough patch. I know you mentioned that in the past and you wanted to
Thank you so
build
much.
people who would have your back essentially. Like I appreciate what you're doing. I realize just how important it is and you've changed my life. And I'm sure you've done the same for pretty much everyone on here. So thank you.
Thank you. That's so meaningful. I appreciate that so much, Lawrence. And wonderful. Thank you. And you did have my back being on today, and I appreciate the ongoing sentiment of that. So awesome. Love you guys. What's that?
It was fun.
Excellent. Excellency. Told you it'd be. What is it? He says there's a pretty funny guy that does these screenwriter pitch meetings. It's kind of worth looking up. They're pretty funny on these movies. But he has a phrase. It's super easy, barely an inconvenience. So
I know that guy. Yeah, hilarious.
Oh, you know him? Yeah, right, great. It's super easy, barely an inconvenience. I wanted to say that's what I wanted. Mike and I showed Mike, and he loves watching those too. So we say that to each other now.
He has a shirt. You should buy it. He has merch.
Yeah, merchant. Yeah, he has merchandise, and he does. He's under the first guy to do whatever. Yeah, pitch meeting. There we go. The pitch meeting guy. Awesome. Okay, take care, Lawrence. I'll see you in the future, and love you guys. I'll reach out to you, Joseph, and others. And well, I'm not quite sure who we'll have on even next time. I don't have that scheduled, so we'll see. But it should almost certainly be in 2 weeks. If I screw up the time, if I'm ever not going to have the webinar like in 2 weeks exactly at 4 p.m. Eastern, I'll make a real clear note of it. So if it ever says something differently and I haven't made a note of it, it's really easy for me to mess up the time in MeWe. I even checked it, but it's anyway, I checked and still screwed it up with MeWe. And then I had it wrong on GoToWebinar for a moment until I fixed it, and then I posted it wrong in one of my posts, etc. So anyway, always 2 weeks at 4 p.m. unless I say otherwise. Okay. Awesome, guys. Thanks so much for your great discussion today. Terrific discussion here in the chat. Great webinar, and this also shows a format that you guys can see, so you can copy that. You can, in addition to doing a whole presentation like Megan, which I also welcome if someone wants to do that. That was terrific. Then also, but don't be kind of intimidated by that if you're not at that, if you don't have that prepared in your life. That was something Megan had kind of explained to a number of people and wanted to share. But if you instead, this is an awesome webinar in the Lawrence style as opposed to the Megan style. So either one is totally appropriate, and I love it. And I can also have 2 people on if it's more like a half thing, so we can play it by ear. Awesome, guys. I'll end it here, and I'll see you soon.
Bye, everyone.